There we go. Are we right to go, guys? AV guys, great, because we've got a big audience online as well. So good morning, everyone who's in the room. It's a great pleasure to be here and start day 3 of the National Housing Conference. My name's Kim Horton. I'm the Chief Economist at the Regional Australia Institute. So this issue of housing in regions is very dear to my heart personally, but also to the Institute. We've done quite a bit of work on this over the last couple of years. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting, and I offer my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I really do appreciate their allowing us to meet in this way on their land at this particular time. This session is being recorded and will be available for delegates to view after the conference as well. Today we'll be taking questions both online and from in the room. For those joining us online, please use the Q&A tab that you'll see on your screen. I was using that a little bit on Tuesday, and there is a tab that you can click on to submit your questions. I'll get those. They'll be fed through to me, so you'll be able to participate actively in the discussion. For those in the room, if you'd like to ask a question, please, the note here says, please keep your questions succinct to enable you to get through as many as possible. I'd also ask that you please make the questions really incisive so we can try to get a bit underneath. I feel the conference has been fantastic, but we sort of, as we often do, we're getting a bit stuck at the top level stuff. So if you've got prickly questions, please throw those. You know, I'd really want to get to some of the underlying issues that the old stage is that there's a number of elephants in a number of these rooms, and if you want to throw some questions at those, that would be fantastic. Before I introduce today's presenters, I'd like to acknowledge the experience for the participation of people who've had lived experience of housing vulnerability who are at the conference, either as presenters or delegates. Your voices are important in helping us shape a better future for housing outcomes in the future. And on a personal note, I'm going to take just a couple of minutes. I went this morning up to the site of Cranbourne House, which is about 5 k's from here on the river. And I just want to illustrate a little story about the history of this place and the importance of safe and secure housing for our communities of whichever colour. Cranbourne House, it turns out from the helpful little plaques that were there, was for a brief time an Aboriginal girls' hostel from 1900 to 1906. Now I thought that's a very short period. A lot of these institutions were around for a long time. It was terminated in 1906 because the community around it, which the decision makers around it, which was the white community around Brisbane at the time, and Brisbane at the time was a real frontier town, that community had decided that after 4 years, in 1904 they started the petition for that facility to close. They felt that the treatment that girls were getting in that facility was detrimental to their health and well-being, and that clearly the benefits of colonisation weren't flowing to those particular Indigenous kids who'd been taken from their families. So, and that was judged on the standards of the time. So that said an awful lot to me about where this place, where we've come from as a city, where we've come from as a country, and where we've come from in our very long journey towards reconciliation. The fact that those white citizens of Brisbane, after just 4 years, realised that that facility was detrimental to the residents and was counter to all their objectives about assimilation, even on their own standards, was really very telling. And I won't go into some of the more detailed stories that you can find about that place. They're absolutely horrific and not isolated to a particular community or a particular location either. So, you know, those lived experiences really do influence the way I think we think about housing precarity, housing security, and we have a long history of trying to deal with that in this country. The apartment I've been staying with during the conference looks over Musgrave Park, so I came back from my visit to the site of Cranbourne House to see yet again every morning the tents that are in Musgrave Park. So we've got a lot of work to do, right? And this is just in the city context. What we're talking about here is how that's playing out across regions. And I've got a bit of a structure in mind for this morning, so we'll cover issues around what makes regions different, what some of the structural issues are that are affecting regions, and coming to some really innovative stories about what people in regions are doing to advance their housing circumstances. So we've got a bit of a flow going, I think, for the questions. But I'm going to start by introducing each of our speakers just with their names and affiliations, and then each of them will give a short presentation so that you get a sense about where they're coming from in their work on regional housing. So just to run through the names, our presenters today are Steve Dunn, Founding Director of Regional Housing Victoria, a member-based peak body representing the interests of regional councils. housing providers and communities. Steve has held senior executive positions in government and consulting for over 35 years in urban planning, social and affordable housing and economic development, and as a board member for a registered housing provider for over 10 years. Welcome, Steve. Sitting next to Steve is Kayla Clancy from Shelter New South Wales. Kayla's worked at Shelter, the state's peaked housing body and advocacy body for low-income households, since mid-2021 as a policy officer with a regional focus. Kayla has previously worked as a town planner for two regional cities, Orange and Armidale, both in New South Wales, and completed her Bachelor of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of New England. Kayla continues to live in regional New South Wales and has a particular passion for housing justice that delivers livable and regional communities for people of all incomes, tenure types and backgrounds. Welcome, Kayla. And on Kayla's right is Sarah Amos from the Queensland Department of Housing. And I don't have a bio for you, so I'll get you to introduce yourself when you do your presentation. Thanks, Sarah, and welcome. So what I'll do now is invite Steve to introduce yourself, your work, Regional Housing Victoria, and some of the issues that you see facing housing in regional Australia. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Kim. Thanks for the introduction, and welcome everybody. And I'd like to acknowledge as well that we're meeting today on the lands of traditional owners and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge any First Nations people here today. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today. I want to, by way of introduction, tell you a little bit of a story about our organisation, Regional Housing Victoria. We've called this Mission Possible, Advancing Social and Affordable Key Worker Housing in Regional Victoria. So, Regional Housing Victoria, this is a school in Regional Victoria. It says EST 1877. That's a long time ago. Regional Housing Victoria is an EST 2023, so it's only this year, very new. I think. We did this for a particular reason, and I'll just tell you a little bit of a story. So in the past, actually I'll just go back one. In the past, the issue of housing has not really been, a local government story in regional Victoria or in metro areas as well. Councils were not encouraged. It was really state government that had the housing portfolio, public and social housing. Local government was sort of kept out of it. But things have really changed. And we now have this strong demand for social and affordable housing right across the state, right across the country. And in 2020, things really changed in Victoria with the big housing build. So this was the $5.3 billion program that the state government put in place. And of course, you'd remember back, there was this thing called COVID, pre-COVID. Councils did not have a strong role. And I think things changed particularly during this time. So we had the funding coming in. Rural and regional Victoria, is about 23% of the Victorian population, and the big housing build offered 25% of that spend going into regional Victoria. So all of a sudden, the state government was wanting local government to be involved, talking about partnerships with councils. Prior to that, some of the larger metro councils had played a role, where they had the resources to do that and the need, but it was not really like that in regional Victoria. So not only did they have the state asking them to get involved, but their communities as well, saying that housing supply is a real issue. So the big housing build has already invested over $1 billion in regional Victoria. We have a couple of additional funding opportunities with the $1 billion Regional Housing Fund, promising 1,300 new homes. So this has really come in Victoria as a result of the cancellation of the Commonwealth Games. So some of that legacy funding is now being directed into housing in regional Victoria, which is a good thing. And we have a $150 million fund, which is called the Regional Worker Accommodation Fund. So there is some funding coming through. So at the time that all this was happening, I was working in Homes Victoria, state government, and my role there was basically forming partnerships, building partnerships with councils and community housing providers and trying to connect people up. And at that time I met Roger. So Roger Hastrich, who's in the audience today, is the other director within Regional Housing Victoria. Roger was working in Geelong with the G21 councils, helping them to address the issues of housing affordability and what they could do. So we thought that we would create a peak body. As Roger likes to say, if you call yourself a peak body, then you're a peak body. But it was really about building a network. Building a network across regional Victoria. We could see the need for support. A lot of councils were really, starting from a low base without a lot of resourcing, without a lot of experience. So we could see the need to connect them up so that they could learn from one another as a network, but also a role for us to coach, to support, to help, to advise, that sort of thing. So that's what we've been doing. And we've been talking now to about 24 councils across Victoria and, really enjoying that work and seeing the creativity, the inspiration, the courage in some cases of councils, getting on and trying to do something positive for their communities. And I wanted to talk to you about some of those things that we've seen in the last, 7 or so months, talking to those councils. We hear that there is a real supply of both market housing, but also social and affordable housing, the not-for-profit housing. There is, considerable market failure. So for renters, finding accommodation, finding affordable accommodation is a real problem. And we're hearing from a lot of those councils, whose role has been more predominantly in the past around economic development, so supporting job growth, supporting their local economies. They're seeing that the lack of affordable housing is a real handbrake on economic growth. They're hearing from businesses that are either wanting to expand or businesses that are wanting to start up, and their people can't find accommodation, or they're having to travel long distances. So some of the examples, some of the things that we're hearing that are quite inspiring and have a positive note about them in the regions. Creativity and forming partnerships both with state government, so taking the opportunity to participate in things like the big housing build, starting from a very low base and getting moving quickly. Some councils not waiting for government or private sector but doing it themselves. So, something we see in regional areas with a few councils actually subdividing land and getting involved in the property market, forming partnerships with developers and selling properties because there's no one else doing it. So they're taking that risk. Councils are looking for funding to build important infrastructure. So things like we've seen one council obtain a grant, build a bridge so that land can be developed, unlocking previously undevelopable land, that sort of thing. Small projects, but make a significant difference in a small town. Things like getting involved in tiny homes and use of things like caravans on properties and freeing up some of their local laws so that those things can happen more easily or more quickly. Some councils actively supporting developers who want to build their own housing, and there are stories of business operators building the housing that their workers need at the same time that they're expanding their businesses. So employers becoming landlords, sometimes in a small scale, sometimes larger. We think that some of the antagonism that might have existed in the past between developers and councils, it's pretty traditional, is changing. In some cases, and they're now looking to form partnerships because they're both working on a common problem and they have a common goal, and that is to support their community but grow jobs, grow the economy and help people to find accommodation. So how can we do that together? Roger and I have been involved in a few forums and seminars and things where those councils are bringing people together to have those conversations. One of our member councils is actually underwriting a developer who they've encouraged to build new housing that can be a rental accommodation for local workers. But because there was some reluctance and some uncertainty about how that might work, the council has taken the step of underwriting the rental income, and they're pretty confident that they won't need to spend anything, but they've got the funds there available that they can back that project up if need be. So, that's quite an amazing thing to do for a council. And we've got a council that's looking for investors to help them put prefabricated homes on their land, so close to town. They've got some spare land. They're going to use prefab because it'll be quicker, it'll be built in the local area or nearby, and they're looking for investors to help them do that. So there's some of the examples that we're seeing, and they're quite amazing things. And you know, the idea of building a network is that councils can learn from one another, be inspired by one another, and we can share those experiences and that knowledge. There are also some issues, some problems that we hear that come up on a fairly regular basis. Things like the lack of planners in regional areas, so planning staff to help them through the development approvals process or the rezoning process. We know that those issues can be quite complex, where you've got things like bushfire overlays, flooding issues, and then all of the other issues that go around planning approvals, the need for infrastructure and so on. And the centralisation of decision-making in metro areas tends to suck the planning staff out of regional areas and move them into the bigger cities. So that can be an issue. In some cases, there aren't sufficient developers, you know, or there is this reluctancy to invest because of uncertainty. And so that's certainly an issue in the current climate. Some communities are concerned about social housing and what their community thinks of that. We still see that. Most of that is, you know, the local community hasn't seen it before, they're not sure what it is, they don't understand it, and so there can be a negative response. We have done some coaching to address that issue about how the council can work in that sort of environment and educate the community. And often it's, you know, the housing that's being built there is for the local community and for the people that need it. And we have a theory, and we're exploring this, that we think that there are some biases against grant funding for regional areas because they are smaller scale. They don't offer necessarily the same per unit value proposition as they can with bigger projects, and so the smaller projects are often not done because they can't be successful in that expression of interest process or grant funding process, and so that's one of the things we think need to be addressed. We had in Victoria the big housing build guaranteed 25% of the spend, but it also had a minimum guarantee spend in some locations. That was a good thing, but we need to see that the decision making around where funding is distributed acknowledges the need for some of these smaller projects or projects that aren't going to give the same value proposition but can have quite a significant impact on people's lives in those locations. So of course there's all of those challenges, but we are seeing innovation, we're seeing collaboration, we're seeing creativity, and that's quite inspiring. And so we've established this peak body. We're doing a little bit of policy and advocacy work where we can, but the real reason is that we saw the need for this organisation as an enabler and to help share ideas and share those ideas across rural and regional Victoria. So Roger and I are here today. We're happy to talk to anybody who'd like to talk to us, and we're hoping that through Kim there can be an ongoing dialogue across the states as well, because we know there are lots of good examples and good ideas elsewhere outside Victoria. Thank you.
Great introduction. Thanks, Steve. Kayla, would you like to introduce yourself and the work that you do and the interests and concerns that you have about housing in regions?
All right. Yep, that's okay. Can everyone hear me? Yep. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the introduction. I also wish to acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Yugara and Turrbal people, Meandrin country, and when we're talking about housing justice in Australia, we are always talking about First Nations justice with that. As Dr. Kim mentioned, my background is as... Oh, I better start this, shouldn't I? There we go. So my background is as policy officer to the peak housing advocacy body Shelter New South Wales, and I've always lived in regional or rural Australia, mostly Queensland, Northern Territory, New South Wales. So I bring a strong regional focus to my job. Shelter's mission is the pursuit of housing justice and a housing system that delivers a secure home for all, and especially low-income households. We do this through membership engagement, research, policy development, alliances and campaigns, formal submissions on plans and policies, and good old-fashioned lobbying of elected representatives. So I note that today's session is called New Thinking in Regional Housing, and I want to stick to the session's brief as much as possible, but a lot of what I'm going to talk about is not especially revolutionary or new. It's just getting back to the basics of good public interest land use planning and strong compliance principles. In order to apply new thinking in regional housing, it's important to address why we need that new thinking. What is going wrong to warrant such a reset? What challenges persist and why? Does the new thinking require new funding, resources, capital, or does it simply require strong political conviction? I think it's a bit of column A and a column B. So through this lens, I want to talk about strain in regional housing markets associated with poorly utilised existing housing stock, as well as underestimating social impacts and housing availability, affordability with booming projects and economic development in the regions. I'll try to offer some recommendations in rectifying these issues, and they'll obviously be drawn from the context of regional New South Wales. However, I hope there are some universal principles in here that we can discuss later on in the panel. So the context setting. A big chunk of what I will be talking about today is whole home holiday accommodation. It's my special interest area, and I've presented to the New South Wales Independent Planning Commission on this topic for Byron Bay earlier this year. Home sharing platforms such as Airbnb have moved a long way from being incidental income makers for owner-occupiers in their primary place of residence. They now operate as quasi-hotels for property investors, being commercial in nature and with an eroding effect on the total stock of housing able to be used by residents as homes. I should note here that at Shelter, we have made a point in our verbal and written communications to not call this short-term rental accommodation. So it tends to gaslight the actual renters who are being turfed from their homes to flip it to holiday homes. And it's recognised in some touristy locations that holiday homes are nothing new or inherently problematic, but where the rub lies is in the easy conversion of dwellings as a result of the gigification of housing through online platforms. So dwellings being converted to the non-hosted holiday market, which perhaps up until a decade ago would have been on the local renters market or owner-occupied. And I've just got up on screen here an extract of a 2020 study, so before COVID, published and summarising the various regulatory responses to the phenomena of online booking platforms, such as Airbnb, stated that in popular tourist destinations, including Hobart, affected by the normalisation of peer-to-peer accommodation, these destinations experience reduced quality of life for residents, reduced housing availability, affordability, and changes in the character of neighbourhoods. I also noted yesterday as I was walking through the exhibition centre, at the same time as this conference, there is the Asia Pacific Mayoral Forum and City Summit, and a major sponsor of that event is Airbnb. So go figure. The lure of higher profits per week in converting a dwelling to non-hosted accommodation through easy-to-use platforms such as Airbnb has gone basically unchecked in New South Wales, with the introduction of a very high exemption cap for days let per year and only in some jurisdictions. So how is this problem unique in regional areas or regional New South Wales? The private rental market has had to make up for the widening three-way gap that we see between suitable housing topologies in the regions, nationally declining home ownership and declining public housing stock. These factors, coupled with a very low residential rental vacancy rates and the general volatility of the housing market in regional areas, creates real pain for low-income households and especially renters in the private market. Migration trends during COVID and the ability for Sydney employed professionals to work remotely contributed to a deepening crisis for regional New South Wales. Locals with lower incomes relative to Sydney natives have seen rental asking prices skyrocket 20% or more year on year, and rental vacancy rates drop below 1% for extended periods of time. Added into this mix is the reliance on one or two industries in regional towns for productivity. In many coastal or scenic areas, one of these two industries is tourism. In other areas, it may be resource extraction or some other boom-bust industry. And in other regions, it's an unholy combination of the two. Domestic tourism was supercharged during the pandemic. International travel restrictions meant a lot of holidaymakers made do with regional holiday destinations. And at the same time, globally, we have seen the proliferation of online platforms, which have made holiday letting so accessible and lucrative for landlords. So as a stocktake, what we have in the regions is the storm of unsuitable and sluggish housing stock topology and private housing market, purchase or rent, and we can talk about this more in the panel, limited public housing stock, a high proportion of marginalised, disadvantaged cohorts in private rental market, the volatile rental vacancy rates, particularly in economically booming towns and or seasonally popular towns, digital disruptors such as Airbnb and then the COVID migration, and local economies reliant on one or two big sectors such as tourism and a boom and bust industry. So why should this problem be solved or addressed? With ongoing supply chain, finance and labour challenges in the construction sector, it's always worthwhile to examine how efficiently are we using our existing housing stock and how reliant are our measures of that existing housing stock. Without localised and evidence-informed regulation of whole home conversions to Airbnb and so on, we will continue to see rental availability and affordability pressures mount in various locations through seasonal or macro level cycles of popularity and economic development. And as we know with most market fluctuations, those least able to weather these storms are very low to low moderate income households. And running parallel to and sometimes intertwined with this issue is that of the poor planning frameworks we have for capturing cumulative social impacts in development assessment. In New South Wales, specific social impact assessments do not need to accompany all big projects, only those that are classified as designated or state significant development. So when we're looking at infrastructure announcements for regional areas, expanded mining operations in some instances, or renewable energy zones, the accompanying land use planning framework has little safeguards for assessing in a cumulative way the impacts on housing availability and affordability as a result of subsequent development. What ends up happening in some unlucky locations is big investment projects relying on existing housing stock to absorb workforce growth, and local authorities overestimating what that existing housing stock is to accommodate the growth because of unfettered dwelling conversions to the whole home holiday market. The gentrification effect and socio-spatial impacts of having amusement park style towns and communities is also not sustainable socially. Holidaymakers in pristine, underutilised, Instagram-worthy homes at the same time that local residents are living in hotels and caravan parks. It's the complete inverse of how these accommodation types are meant to be used. And in regional areas, if you can't find suitable accommodation in your town, you're faced with the prospect of moving 2 hours away to the next regional town that can offer that and severing your social ties. We have heard anecdotally at Shelter of social workers at Coffs Harbour telling families applying for social housing to try their luck further inland in the New England region. All the while, Tamworth's food production and processing economy has boomed, and low-income residents there are having to look further afield to secure housing. But not to Uralla, because that's got a major renewable energy zone. So where do these people go? And so the displacement goes on and on. It's a moving feast, creeping inland, and always the buck stopping with low-income households. So the general picture that we arrive at is that the Commonwealth, state and local governments need to proactively anticipate economic growth areas and the corresponding cohorts who will need to be adequately housed. We need to constantly demand that big, exciting announcements for the regions are accompanied by public investment in housing. There's a bit of a culture regionally that you get what you're given and be thankful for it. But we actually should be demanding more supporting infrastructure to underpin shiny new project announcements, and this includes public housing. As with everything, we need good baseline data on existing housing stock, private, public, community and affordable rental housing, and how that housing stock is being utilised or underutilised. We need a combination of regulation to manage and monitor the growth of whole home holiday accommodation, especially where local studies have identified this phenomenon as having had a significant impact on housing availability, affordability, infrastructure provision and social disadvantage. And this includes recognising whole home conversions as a change of use, requiring development consent and capping the number of consents issued in line with local studies into the maximum allowable cap that the housing market can sustain. Tax levies, where revenue is directed to the provision of social and affordable housing, is another mechanism that is worthwhile in its own right. Even if it doesn't discourage that conversion, you're at least getting some money out of it for public housing. We need to resource councils properly to do compliance and monitoring. We also need better cumulative impact assessment on housing and quality of life indicators for commercial, industrial and infrastructure projects, no matter the development status of significance in the planning system. And this is where mandatory inclusionary zoning is often talked about in the context of urban environments, but we really need a regional framework too, so that no one region misses out and regions are not forced to compete with one another in attracting new industry commercial investment. So a constant slow drip of funding and in-kind contributions to social and affordable housing for all relevant development projects will go some way to ensuring low-income households reap the same benefits from big investment projects. And that's all I've got. So thank you, and I look forward to discussing more in the panel.
Thank you, Kayla, for lifting the lid on some of those contentious issues. I look forward to exploring those in the Q&A. Sarah, over to you. Could you give us an overview of your Queensland Government's interest in regional housing and what the issues and responses are?
Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everyone. My name's Sarah Amos. I'll do a quick introduction as I was a bit of a late ring into this session, but very happy to be here today. So I've come into the newly established Department of Housing, so being freshly minted on the 18th of May as a new standalone department with a significant focus on the delivery of housing. My role is the Acting Deputy Director General, Social and Affordable Housing Growth. So you can see in my title, it's a rather big step and shows the direction we're trying to go as a department more generally. But before I kick off more generally, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we meet today, the Turrbal and Yagara people. I'll pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I'd also extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So now to the topic. So if we're thinking about new thinking in regional housing, I think one of our key starting points is where do we sort of centre that within the Queensland Government. So Queensland is a vast and regionally diverse and decentralised state. It has 77 local government areas across 9 regions, including remote and discrete Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. The Queensland Department of Housing owns, manages or supports through our community housing providers and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander councils a portfolio of over 75,000 social homes delivered across the state in cities and regions and in remote and discrete communities. It's not an insignificant task when you consider the area this spans. Underpinning the state's vision for Queensland's housing system is the Queensland Housing Strategy 2017 to 2027. This 10-year strategy outlines clearly the Queensland Government's commitment to making sure all Queenslanders have a pathway to safe, secure and affordable housing. The strategy is being delivered across successive housing action plans, which includes the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Housing Action Plan from 2019 to 2023, and the Queensland Housing and Homelessness Action Plan. While these action plans include a range of initiatives to support housing and delivery and broader homelessness supports across the state, it includes 2 key actions. So Action 5 in the Queensland Housing and Homelessness Action Plan includes a specific action to work with local councils to improve availability, diversity and quality of housing across Queensland, particularly in regional and remote communities, We also have Action 1 in our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Housing Action Plan, which is to work with First Nations communities to develop place-based, community-led plans to identify and respond to local housing challenges and priorities. This is all with a focus to support our regions to ensure housing meets the needs of their communities and drives sustainable economic prosperity. One of the key initiatives against this action item is partnering with local governments to develop local housing action plans. Through local housing action plans, the state is working with councils to identify actions to support housing outcomes with a plan structured around 8 common themes. Now, the themes I don't think will surprise people, but it's good to call them out and to make sure we're thinking about them, each and every aspect of that. So it's land, it's planning, it's optimisation. We're looking at capital solutions, construction, who we're targeting and how we're delivering supports. And through the development of these plans, local governments in partnership with the state are unpacking local housing conditions and challenges, because we know each of these regions are unique in their own way, and driving action across short, medium and longer term horizons. The first of the plans were developed between the state and Gympie Regional Council in 2022. We've then partnered with the Western Queensland Alliance of Councils to deliver local housing action plans for their 22 member councils. These 23 local housing action plans are all now completed and adopted by these councils. In March this year, the Queensland Government also announced a further funding for the Local Government Association of Queensland to support a further 38 local councils across Queensland with their local housing action plans. This next tranche of plans are to be completed by March 2024. In addition, we have 19 community-led local housing plans that are being developed with First Nations communities, with these plans looking at local decision-making, home ownership, land availability and housing growth, economic development opportunities, and culturally informed design. Importantly, implementation of these plans is led by each council, and each plan is also a living document and which council can update as its circumstances change or as actions get completed. Through these plans, we're working to understand the specific challenges of each local government area. For instance, while in the Department of Housing, we're very focused on the delivery of social housing. This is not always the need in every community. Instead, in some communities, the focus is on how best to increase market and key worker accommodation to ensure these communities can continue to attract and retain the people and talent in their regions. These plans also help to understand areas of commonality across local governments and opportunities for regional collaboration or whole of government solutions. The Western Councils have arrived at a set of common actions which speak to the challenges of housing supply and diversity, as well as the need for targeted supports. Some of these common actions include, and won't surprise anybody, is how do we look better or closer at those relevant planning schemes to ensure they meet the evolving needs of communities. We know at the moment where it was a detached dwelling in the past, and that's what everyone wanted in those particular areas, that's no longer necessarily the only product type. And if we're trying to attract new young workers to the region, some of them don't want to live in that. They want to have departments, so that increased focus and need for diversity is becoming a key focus. So when we're looking at those planning schemes, we're going, what does it mean for density? What does it mean for opportunities for secondary dwellings, mixed use development opportunities, repurposing of unused commercial space, and expanding the types of construction permitted. It also includes looking at what are our options to incentivise investment, including, and particularly in some of our regional areas, innovative approaches to land sales. And I'll call out an example with Flinders Shire Council, which released 48 affordable blocks of lands for sale to attract families and to grow their community. They had some conditions around sort of the timing of when they wanted that land to be developed as well, but it was all about incentivising how do you start to drive that investment in community. We also are looking at how we establish and expand mechanisms for engaging with communities to ensure their views are taken on board in guiding how we plan for housing delivery in these communities. The Queensland Government is also considering how we come alongside these councils, such as how we deliver social housing through an equitable delivery approach. And so definitely on some of our key projects, such as key programs, such as Quick Starts Queensland, we look to deliver almost 50% of that outside southeast Queensland. So we very much take a regional delivery approach when we're looking to how we roll out social housing. We're also looking at how other housing is procured and delivered, such as through our government employee housing. We're looking at how existing government housing financial supports and loans can be tailored to better meet regional needs. We're identifying housing and accommodation demand and what's needed to be done in relation to things like large projects when they're being identified for some of our key regional centres. We've got a lot of resources activity happening across the state, new significant rolls out of energy infrastructure. Each of those have impacts on those regional communities, and working with councils, we're trying to make sure that they are well placed to respond to those challenges. As another key area of emerging interest, and I know it's already been spoken to this morning, is modern methods of construction and modular housing, and how that is growing as an area of opportunity in the right circumstances to accelerate supply. And we note that it might not always be the right solution, and there's a range of things to think about when you're looking at that product. But the Queensland Government, through QBuild, is building its capacity in the delivery of modular homes, including through partnerships with 11 suppliers. We're also, through the Department of Housing, delivering packages of modular homes across the state, with a total of 53 new social homes being delivered across rural and regional Queensland. QBuild has also developed a rapid accommodation and apprenticeship centre, which was established at Eagle Farm in March 2023, and another has been established in Zilma, and a third is being progressed in Cairns. Okay. As one of the first local governments to finalise their local housing action plan, I thought I would share with you some of the outcomes from Gympie. Some of you may be aware, Gympie was one of the areas hardest hit by severe weather and flooding event in early 2022. A key action that was progressed in partnership with the council and the state was the development of crisis accommodation, and that was through the department leasing the caravan park at the from the Gympie Regional Council to provide immediate and to medium-term accommodation through what we call the Gympie Recovery Accommodation Park. Since then, over 30 households have been supported through the park with places to live while they recover. Supports were also established to link these households to health, financial, employment and mental health services. Queenslanders who have lived at the park have moved on to buy new homes, return to their repaired homes, rent private properties and secure social housing. This also meant that as flood-affected households move on from the park, it's now providing ongoing housing and homelessness supports for Gympie residents. The park also included 5 modular homes and 8 tiny homes acquired by the department and deployed to the site to increase the park's capacity to 34 units of accommodation. These can also be relocated in certain circumstances, such as when there's a future flood threat. And the state government continues to work with the Gympie Regional Council as they implement their plan. So then, just some final observations before I finish up and ensure we have time for discussion. In the context of the current economic climate, new thinking is required when we consider housing delivery across the state. And so regions matter, so does the rest of the state, but there are different complexities across each of these. The Department of Housing, along with other agencies, and I'll particularly call out the Department of State Development, Infrastructure, Local Government and Planning here in Queensland, are looking at all levers to how we support this outcome. It could be planning changes, it could be homelessness supports and crisis accommodation, it could be traditional construction, modular builds and tiny homes. In working through these solutions, we need to consider the specific needs of the communities, as there's no one-size-fits-all solution, but we also have to recognise there can be commonality and where there are opportunities to have regional partnerships or take a whole-of-state approach where that's necessary. I would also acknowledge that, particularly with the state, we don't have all the answers, and regardless of what to do, we look to partner, and that could be with local governments, that could be with community housing providers, service providers and the private sector to ensure we bring the best thinking to bear on what continues to be a complicated issue affected by a range of compounding factors. And I would also call out with that just those additional levels of government and the steps that the federal government is now taking. I think the Housing Australia Future Fund is a really significant and important step forward in supporting the delivery of housing supply across the state. We're particularly focused on ensuring that it is all of the state that benefits from that, including and particularly our regions, because we know where there's need and demand. I think there are also other initiatives that they're looking at the moment, particularly with a focus on infrastructure investment as well, and we are very keen to ensure that all of our local governments are able to access that to support the growth in their communities as well. So with that, I'll say thank you for your time, and I look forward to the questions.
That was a really good overview and touched on a lot of those sensitive issues about regions. So thank you very much, and thanks to all three of you for doing the same sort of thing. Now, we are focusing this morning on solutions, and I think we've heard a lot of directions and intentions from our panellists here about what some of those solutions might be, what form they might be taking, which is great. And I want to dig into that a bit more in the discussion. But I want to sort of start by having a look a little bit about what's the market failure issue here? Why have regions sort of got to this predicament? I've got some thoughts from the work that the Institute has done, but I think in terms of looking at solutions, it's really useful to know how the market operates in that regional setting, and are the solutions that we're proposing addressing any of those sort of underlying market failures. Steve, can I ask you first, what do you think's changed about this regional housing market in the last couple of years?
Well, I think certainly the migration into regional areas that we've seen sort of during and post-COVID has had an impact, and that was unexpected, and the market has really not had the ability to respond to that very quickly. We've seen things like the short stay accommodation. That's one response, I guess. But in terms of constructing, a diverse housing type and in the right location, it has really been too slow. I mean, prior to that, there were obviously regional centres that were growing, and there was development occurring and change occurring, but probably not at a pace that was necessary. Some of it to do is also the funding of infrastructure. So in some of those regional centres, what's needed is some critical infrastructure to facilitate development, and so that wasn't necessarily there.
Yes.
It was all very focused in probably growth centres in metro areas. That's where the funding was going, and so some of those regional centres weren't receiving the funding that they needed. It wasn't going to be funded through the private sector. It needed to be funded through government. So they were some of the failures. And I guess we've seen particularly that the small investors that own some of the rental accommodation were not necessarily investing in their product. That for them it's their super fund, it's their long-term investment. So they're not investing, and in some cases they've rapidly got out of the market to cash in their investment, and some of those properties have been lost, and so the market is not replacing those. Yeah.
So you're painting a picture of us sort of rolling into this a bit underprepared.
Certainly underprepared, yeah.
And certainly now
unexpected.
And the circumstances changing so that that investor will sort of mum and dad investor sort of proposition is not as strong as it needs to be.
That's right. Well, we've heard stories where the government's talking about rent caps and things like that. Didn't happen, but that did cause some people to get out of the rental market, right? Make a decision to sell. And then that rental property is not being replaced.
Yeah, that's a good point. Kayla, at the sort of affordable end of our regional sort of housing market challenges, why do you think we've got to this position where the sort of availability of that low-cost stock has contracted so much? What are some of the drivers there?
I think it's linked very much to the lack of housing diversity and the topology, and it's very profitable to just continue doing sprawl in regional areas, and there's no real incentive. I feel like the market doesn't quite pick up when there's a change in demand. I think there's still this idea that people move to regional areas because they've got a young family and they want that space, but you've got an ageing population, and they will we've got farmers who want to move into town, so you'll need to have that sort of 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, smaller dwelling, well accessible to community facilities and health services. So the other side of it is that I'm just still talking about the land use framework in terms of housing topology. So then in terms of infill housing in the old town centres, it's not that profitable to do medium density housing of the type and scale that we need. So in terms of market low cost housing, that's one failure. The really big failure though is this declining public housing stock that we've seen for many decades. And you would know, we partnered Regional Australia Institute and Shelter New South Wales, and we did a study on the local government areas in regional New South Wales where it had structural issues with housing need. And across nearly all of those top 10 LGAs that we looked at, social housing stock, so real numbers of social housing stock, had declined from 2010 to 2020. So in some instances it was 8% decline, some instances it's a 12% decline, but nonetheless, we're not talking just transfers to community housing providers, we're talking overall social housing stock decline. So there's just not that investment in social housing. And so then you've got a broadened, as Steve was sort of mentioning, you've got this broadened but very strained rental market, and you haven't got the housing type that you need to have for rentals for people moving through different periods of their lives. So I'd say those two things in combination is making it really challenging.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think one of the things that's changed, and picking up on that point, is that every quarter the Institute does a piece of work with the Commonwealth Bank looking at where people are moving from and moving to, and we've really seen this, and you've all mentioned it, this rippling out of, and it's particularly younger people, so millennial age people are looking for simply availability and affordability, and each quarter is very clear evidence in the data. They're going further and further inland, and you've all kind of mentioned this as a bit of an underlier. And as Steve was sort of saying, they're landing in places that really are not equipped for any sort of population growth. They haven't seen population growth, many of these places, in decades, literally decades. And so they're very under-equipped for this sort of move. That's bringing, I think, this need for a much greater depth of social housing to places that have never had it before. I mean, one of the lovely things about regional Australia is, until very recently, it's always been able to offer a sort of low-cost place to live. I mean, a lot of us live in places that are sort of small, kind of tucked away. A lot of, especially those sort of arts creative places that are up in the hills, you know, low income, low cost, it kind of balanced. Now, this has all been knocked sideways, I think, in the last couple of years. So we've got a lot of work to do. That demand has changed and supply takes a lot longer to catch up. Sarah, you know, there are lots of players in trying to sort of reignite, you know, interest in building regionally. There are lots of players. What sort of work is your department doing to try to, you know, bring those players together and sort of advance the sort of the prospects and the investability of getting some new builds in regional places?
Yeah, look, it's a really important and interesting question. So I think there's a lot of stakeholders at the moment that have a role to play when it comes to the delivery of social housing. And I probably will broaden it a little bit. I think housing in general is probably a key thing that we need across the state, and particularly in some of our regional centres. And as we engage particularly with certain councils, they're identifying that actually they don't need any more social housing, but they definitely need affordable or key worker accommodation. We've got something like 300 FTEs required across some of those councils, and they've got nowhere for those employees to potentially come and live in those regions. And so that becomes a really key focus about how do we drive that investment and ensure that delivery is happening on the ground. From a social housing perspective, we've got a few levers that we're looking at the moment to how we can support that supply. We obviously do direct investment, and we've got a program called Quick Starts Queensland, which is our direct investment program. It kind of works in two different ways. It's both the state delivered housing, so we definitely believe there's a role for public housing and for the state to continue to delivering those assets, but we also know that our community housing provider sector is a really important partner in this. So we're also looking at how we run and how we get CHPs involved in the delivery of that housing across regions. We've also started the Housing Investment Fund, and some of you would probably already be very aware of this. It's something that I've been working on for a number of years now. I did it previously when I was at Queensland Treasury before being in housing, and really happy to still be working and overseeing that program. It's very similar, if you will, potentially to the model that the HAF will take as well, but it allows for, I guess, more partnership type models to come forward and some innovative opportunities around how private sector, CHPs and the state can work together to deliver supply. I guess one of our key challenges is scale and size drives a lot of supply activity. And in certain areas, you might not get the scale and size you need to attract the investors to that space. And that, I think, is a real challenge. And so I do know that there is thinking going on around how could you bundle, how could you take a regional or combined, a whole of region approach to how we deliver housing to deliver better outcomes. So we're thinking about that in our state delivered program, about how we get the builders off the hospital projects and the stadium projects and everything else and focused on social housing. And I know a lot of regional councils starting thinking, well, how else could they bundle their need to be able to attract and ensure they can get the investors and the builders close to them, working in their communities, and get that delivery on the ground.
Yeah, thank you. Steve, are you seeing that too, that desire? Because you mentioned scale, I think, in your presentation. Is that, are you seeing councils getting active in trying to build that sense of scale so they can widen that sort of partner and that investor group?
Well, it's certainly an issue, I think, the scale, and small developers in small towns can be a problem. But yeah, the fact that the funding doesn't necessarily come through because of the small scale, so they're not able to attract the funding that's necessary. Working together, not seeing that so much. I mean, we do get some regional cooperation, but this idea of bundling, I think, is a positive, and that's certainly been talked about in Victoria for a while. But we haven't really seen it play out and happen in the way funding is distributed, for example. But it makes sense, you know, that we think about regional rather than thinking about small centres as a way of creating scale and a way of attracting both CHPs and developers into some of these areas. I mean, even we don't have, you know, probably the representation of CHPs in regional areas that we'd like to see. You know, same issue for them. It's about scale and the ability to service those properties. Yeah.
We had an interesting example, it's actually from a few years ago now, Unity Housing in South Australia, which did that, again, collaborative partnership kind of approach with different stakeholders. They were able to actually get a small number of units spread across a number of towns. So that was kind of cool, because a lot of these investments tend to happen in the one place. But the way that this group did it with a bunch of councils, same sort of funding mechanism, but they got 2 units here, 3 or 4 units there, another couple of units, and all spread across, you know, several hundred square kilometres. That took some sort of regional thinking to drive that. You know, it took people thinking beyond their own immediate town and looking more broadly. And Sarah, as you know, the Institute's done some work with that Western Queensland Alliance Council. In fact, it was quite influential in our thinking about what some of those underlying constraints are. And when we sort of looked at their overall sort of housing need, it was fairly clear that in aggregate, there was a real large pool of investment that was needed with very great certainty in the returns that investment could achieve, because of the way that those areas are structured. You've got very high, if the investment were done well, the returns would be great and long term and very safe, so ideally suited for patient capital. So just exploring that kind of option, the investors, the patient capital investors, were kind of interested in it at that scale. They weren't, interestingly, too concerned that it was spread over a large geography. That really wasn't a concern. What was the concern was they're happy to invest at that scale of looking at around 1,000 dwelling units, really, over that very large geographical area. Happy to invest in it, happy to consider investing in it, so long as there was some kind of structure in between the tenants and them that mediated their risk. And that's, I think, one of the things that really galvanised that group of councils. So I talked before about Unity Housing getting a few councils together. Here you're talking about 23 councils thinking, well, hang on, there's a game changer for us. We've never seen this scale of investment. We've never been able to attract it because of this sort of scale question. What if, what if we set up a structure together which enabled us to attract a totally different class of investor, and were able to guarantee, to de-risk it enough that they would actually take those steps? That's quite challenging for, it's a big step, isn't it? It takes a lot of trust.
I think it is a big step, and I think the conversations are having, and you might not get all 23 at the table, but you might find a way to find some councils that are willing to find some degree of agreement on a model like that. There's always the issues, I think, whenever you're dealing with these types of models or governance arrangements about control and who ultimately has control over their assets. Are their assets the same or comparable with whoever else they're partnering for? Are they old assets, new asset? What's the maintenance requirements? There's a lot of things that come in, and I always find the devil's in the detail. But look, I think it's really encouraging to see that those innovative models are being explored at the moment, and if we can find a path through and they actually ultimately support supply, it's a really good outcome.
Yeah, it would be a big change. Kayla, another prickly question, coming back to your short stay accommodation question, is, for a lot of communities, as you were sort of alluding to, that's long been a part of their mix, and their sort of economic cycles have been built around that. You've raised a couple in your presentation, but I wanted to dig into a little bit further. What are some of the recommendations you have for managing that better? In our smaller spaces, so you're not sort of undermining that sort of long-standing flow of visitors, but you're actually putting constraints around it. And you talked before about good use of planning. I think we can squeeze a lot more of our planning system. And here's one way. What are some of the suggestions that you have for dealing with this vexatious issue a bit better?
Yeah, so I think, as we know, there are some traditional holiday towns that we're all familiar with, and Byron has long been a holiday place for people to visit, and people buy holiday homes there. But what we've seen is this real boom, and I've been looking at the data since about 2018, and you can see the real uptick during COVID in a lot of places, particularly Shoalhaven is another example. So Byron's at critical mass sort of thing. We don't want to see more regional areas get to that crisis point before we start going, perhaps we should have planned for this a bit better. So, for example, Shoalhaven, I think it's on that cusp there where it's got I think 1 in 4 homes are vacant, and they've got more than 3,000 whole home holiday accommodation. So when you look at that, you can see that there's going to be long-term issues in terms of their rental stock if that trend continues. Or, you know, it could be subject to different market variations. But the thing is, if you don't plan for these waves in popularity and these seasonal challenges or macro level challenges, the people who lose out are renters. And renters, more often than not, are, you know, they don't have as much money, they don't have that security, and it's that security of tenure as well. So this idea of a cap system, so capping the amount of days that it can be let out at the whole home, what tends to happen is you might achieve that someone gets a 6-month lease, but then they're gone, so that it can be back on the short-term market. So it's looking at, and this is the recommendations that came out of the Independent Planning Commission, not just for Byron, but for the state government to review its short-term accommodation settings, to look at not just caps, but caps and permits. So over a certain number of days, it's most likely a commercial operation, and that commercial operation requires a change of use. How many change of use consents can we put out into the LGA? And that requires a few steps of research and planning, but we should have been doing that before it got to crisis point in Byron. And to Byron's credit, they've been trying to get something in since about 2003, because this has been a long-standing issue, and it was just accelerated with the likes of Airbnb and then COVID. So those, yeah, I can talk more in depth about the recommended caps and the recommended things, but that's the general overview that we have been getting at Shelter, is that yes, local councils, they want to support their tourism industries and they want to have a sustainable level of conversions. It's just knowing what that sustainable level of conversions is, so that you can still have the hospitality workers, the early childhood educators, the nurses, all of that sort of stuff that you need in each community to thrive.
I know that some councils have written to their non-resident ratepayers asking them to put their properties back on the market if they're not using them very much because of that those local stress points. Another prickly question for me is density. You know, density in our regional places. It's not. It's a prickly question because, as I think you said, Kayla, there's in the planning scheme there is plenty of scope for a little bit of densification around the town centres, even of our smaller places. When we did the work with the Western Queensland Alliance, I was really surprised about when I talked about 1,000 dwellings as being their sort of unmet demand, and this goes back quite some years, that demand has been latent because there's been no capacity to borrow to build. Of that 1,000 or so dwellings, about half of the demand was for 1 or 2 bedroom units. Now, these are places that are really small. You're talking, 300 ratepayers in some of these shires and towns of 200 or 300 people. And yet, the missing middle of that 1 or 2 bedroom unit is very prevalent in those places too. So the market's there, demand's there. We often hear anecdotal examples of someone who's often a community organisation that's gone down the path of doing this kind of deal, like this 1 or 2 bedroom units. They tend to get sold out very quickly, but the builders are not building. I also wonder, in this sort of prickly question way, is there resistance? Is there reluctance in some of our small towns to see even that style of densification? And classic, what you'll see is on the fringe of your town centre, you'll see these large homes or large-ish homes on large lots. They're the ones that have been there since the beginning of town. The town was sort of formed. They'll often have 1 or 2 residents in them now. They might have had big families in them a generation ago, but that's sort of undone. The planning scheme, as I understand it, generally is quite favourable towards redevelopment of these blocks into a slightly higher density, and yet there seems to be a lot of resistance, both from the community and from the developers and builders side. Is this on anybody's radar? Are these things that we need to be thinking about? Changing attitudes and recognising that our communities are changing and that we need to sort of adjust our expectations accordingly?
I think there's certainly resistance in some places. It's patchy. Some of the bigger towns, if you think of Ballarats and Bendigos in Victoria, they are encouraging, higher densities. townhouses and mid-rise sort of buildings, and I think that, you know, in those places there is a higher degree of acceptance. But if you go to some of the smaller towns, yeah, you'd get that sort of resistance. And you're right, builders probably are uncertain about, you know, the viability of building that sort of product. So they, you know, it's a slower probably change of perspective and change of view. Yeah, but there's certainly a need. You know, we've and things like the prefab homes certainly are able to accommodate higher densities, and we've also seen in terms of the worker accommodation, we know at least of one product that it looks more like a house, but is designed for key workers who've got some self-containment, but there are some shared facilities as well. So that's a different product that's specifically designed for workers, and it's going to have a price point that's going to be more attractive, but it's not going to look like a block of flats. It's going to look more like a large house.
Yeah. No, I think that perception thing is really important.
Yeah.
Is it part of your sort of longer term vision, Sarah, to see a little bit more densification in some of our regional places?
It's interesting. I think densification is a conversation that's happening across the state at the moment. So even when we think about built-up cities, we're thinking about densification. And to me, it's a conversation with the community about how you bring them along. We talk about a concept called gentle density. It sort of has been, you know, but I think it shows this conversation about what could we get or what opportunities does a little bit of additional density deliver for our communities. We are really, and I think through the local housing action plans we're doing with the councils, exploring things like density. I think it's exactly the point. We think we understand the community are looking to downsize into 1 or 2 bedroom dwellings. They don't want to leave their community. The option is either I live in a big house and I have a very large block of land to manage, or I have to move out of town, and that just to me doesn't seem like a sustainable option. But you know, it is a journey. It is something that governments work with their communities to be able to implement. So I do think the conversations are being had.
Yeah. Kayla, do you think is the planning scheme, cause my understanding is the planning scheme looks fairly favourably on this, so that is maybe not where the blockage is? What do you think?
Well, this gentle density idea, so in a lot of regional towns, secondary dwellings are very popular. Yeah. People are on board with putting in a secondary dwelling in their backyard. Yeah. But what requires a bit more planning and a bit more thought is where you're looking at doing dual-locks or townhouses, and that might require an amalgamation of a couple of allotments, and that requires you to talk to your neighbour. So before you and your neighbour go putting a secondary dwelling on the back, you actually probably should be chatting with each other and how can we do something across the whole block. And if local councils aren't leading those conversations or putting out expressions of interest for that, what we'll continue to see are just secondary dwellings dotted in here and there, which very well and good, but it's a real wasted opportunity in some really well located areas to not do more, because once that secondary dwelling is built there, unless it's a removable one, it's there for 20, 50 years. So I'd like to see more of that, getting communities to talk amongst themselves about how they would like to see their neighbourhoods grow, where amalgamation of lots might need to occur.
I think it's a really good point, I'd like to open it up for questions either on people online or in the room. Have we got a microphone? Have I got someone with a microphone? Here we go, great, okay. So let's start, there's someone up the back there and then someone on the side here, we'll start with you perhaps on the edge there, thank you. If you could just introduce yourself and say which state you're from.
Gail Labransky, I'm from the New South Wales Housing Appeals Commission and the New South Wales Disability Council. My question relates to modular housing, which has a role to play in increasing the rate at which we are able to supply public housing and also cost considerations. My concern, however, is that there doesn't seem to be an appreciation of accessibility in those modular housing. The 2 examples that you put up in the slide were clearly not accessible. I wonder whether an increase in modular housing without accessibility is going to exacerbate already long waiting lists for people with disability who are not supported by the NDIS in housing, and also the rehousing of people with disability and older people who've been affected by floods and fire.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Sarah.
Look, I think it's a really important point, and as a state, we're looking at how we deliver our social housing product so it ensures it meets of everyone on the social housing register. We focus on delivering over 50% of our product is delivered to gold or platinum standard to ensure it meets accessibility requirements, and that consideration is also taken into account for our modular homes. We have a display village of sorts near each street at Hamilton, which our QBuild has set up at the moment. I don't know if any of you have been told about that to date, or if you haven't. It's a really good opportunity to go out, and I think you can drive up and just go have a look, to be honest. They've got a few different types of modular homes that we're looking at the moment, and they are very much thinking about size, bedroom, like doorway distances, ramps, accessibility. I think that's very much a key focus, and so our state architect has been heavily involved. We're not just sort of, I think there's a perception around a modular home at the moment about a tin box on stilts, and I think we've got to start moving that conversation, because what we're starting to see is a really sophisticated product that's being developed for housing purposes, and that's the type of product we're thinking when we're looking at how we accelerate the delivery of social housing with that product. So like I sort of said, there is that display village. It's if you've got time or you're driving past and you're not from here, it has a few different types. We've got 3 bedrooms, more like government employee housing. We've got smaller dwellings, we've got different material types being used, and it just sort of shows where some of the design thinking is going around that product.
I think that principle of embedding those design principles is critical. Accessibility, but also energy use, energy efficiency, environmental efficiency. I mean, we don't want to be subjecting people to a poor long-term experience because of the way these things have been designed. But on the other hand, I think you're right. We've seen some really interesting examples of people in quite remote parts of Western Queensland being able to source for the first time, a decent product at a reasonable price. I mean, Quilpie's quote of, I think they were having quotes of a sort of putting up a 3-bedroom house in Birdsville was about 1.6 million, and I think putting a similar thing up in Quilpie itself was around 900,000. So they've been able to reduce those costs considerably by going modular. So, and we need, I think, Caleb, we do need the planning scheme to reflect that change too, because I know that in the past many councils have seen modular housing in the same category as caravans, basically like movable homes, and that's problematic because, again, I think you're right, Sarah, we're looking at very different products here. We don't want to tar them with that particular brush and thereby inhibit the accessibility of that sort of option to people, do we?
Yeah, can I just add something? I think that this goes to the deeper concern that we probably all have about this push for more supply, but it's supply without quality and it's supply without amenity. And New South Wales hasn't signed up to that silver standard accessibility, which not yet. But I think not just in terms of accessibility and good embodied carbon and embodied energy principles, but and I'm hoping this comes up. The key worker housing discussions that we're having, there's not really much nuance about housing for whom. Is it just a worker? Is it a worker and their family that they can age in that community, they can get embedded in that community? Because we don't just want transplants that do the work and then we, say goodbye to them. Because if you have a lot of, again, talking about topology, if you have just one housing type for key workers, and if it is dormitory style, that's not really conducive to raising a family. And that's my concern, is that we do need a lot of different key workers, and we need, women, a lot of women in these workforces, in these care economy workforces too. So are we building housing for the whole family in that instance?
Yeah, thanks. Steve, any?
Oh, look, I think it's been pretty much covered. I think there's a role for prefabricated housing, particularly where it can reduce cost in the right location, the right time. But the issues of quality and accessibility remain just as important. So, yeah, we can't lose that.
Got a question down the back here, and then someone over here on the corner, maybe you on the corner over there afterwards. So this guy over here, and then next to you. Thank you.
Yeah, Chris from In Community Tenancy Skills. Look, when we have a natural disaster, and often the homes that are impacted are usually those occupied by those on the lower socio-economic scale. We all realise that. And I'm really quite perplexed, and also in Queensland we have a dynamic where we've got 3 regional cities where this occurs, and it's the disproportionate cost of household insurance that is happening. It is having a huge impact. Look, we're even hearing whispers, like we run a youth shelter, and even gaining indemnity insurance around having young people housed with workers, those premiums are starting to escalate a lot. And I've heard so much, and this really impacts regional Australia disproportionately as well. So you try and insure a house in Townsville as opposed to insuring in Brisbane and see the ridiculous difference in cost. And you can be in a street or a suburb that's never had a robbery ever, but you still pay more money. Or one side of your street might flood, but your side doesn't. You pay more in premiums. Why is no one talking about insurance? No one's mentioned it, the whole conference.
Yeah, no, it's a bunch of things we haven't really talked about, I think, and that's a good one. Anybody have any responses to that?
Can I go? My family is from Roma in Western Queensland, and the Climate Council put out a report, I think, last year, and it was in the top 5 LGAs that will be most likely to be uninsurable by 2050, essentially. So we've got reports out there warning that a lot of homes and residences are not going to be insurable, or and I think they count uninsurable as it's not worth the cost to insure it. So you're right, we need to look at socialised insurance models and where those locations are and who pays for that. And that's a broader question about climate change. Who's been the biggest contributor? How do we then levy those? I know we're getting way out of our remit today, but that is something that I was really glad at the last National Housing Conference in Melbourne. This was a particular session that I attended, and it just blew my mind the amount of information we know, but we're just not preparing for it. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll come to you in a sec. I think one of the other things that really I haven't seen much airplay about is actually just financing. We know that as you go further west in this country, those markets they're essentially the markets become stalled because with very few transactions, then the banks are unwilling to lend to borrowers because they perceive it as a higher risk. Funnily enough, if they don't lend to potential borrowers, there are very few transactions. So it becomes completely circular, and it's all based on this perception of risk. So our poor colleagues in Western Queensland have markets that are completely stalled because there's been no new building, and so there will be no new building in the future. So that's a challenge. That's not about supply. It's not about planning. It's not about any of these other things. It's simply about the way that our current mortgage system works, and that needs to change, believe me. Now we've got a question down on the end of the row here. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim, and thanks everyone. I've got a question, I think, that goes to some of these systemic issues that are arising, and it's about the role of policy, both at the state and the federal level, and where the massive gaps are. So we've got, as you described, Kim, we've got thin markets in many rural regional areas. And in reality, what that means is things like, say, in Castlemaine, where we are, where your in-ground infrastructure is 100 years old. So that's been able to carry the sort of stable growth that has occurred since the 1800s, but it clearly can't accommodate medium density, intensification in a town. And then, so we've got these barely serviced regional rural infrastructure and ecosystems, but we don't have the policy settings that recognise that. So there's not a intelligent way of funding economic development and housing and infrastructure. You've got to apply here for this chunk, and you've got to apply here for this chunk, and you've got to go through massive processes with all of them. If we had different policy settings that recognised the long-term development needs of rural and regional Australia, then we could have far more efficient processes for actually addressing those needs. I'm just interested in your thoughts.
Yeah. Sarah, can I get you go first, Nate? Because you're looking to try to bring this sort of whole of government perspective, aren't you?
And it is, and it does start to become a whole of government perspective. It's not just housing, and I know obviously our Department of State Development, which has local government remit, it has a key role to play in how they work alongside councils and how they're funded to deliver their services and meet the requirements of their community. So I don't think I have a perfect answer for you in terms of how we solve that problem, but I think we're very much aware that if you're going to start doing this extent or scale of delivery we're doing, you need to think about the infrastructure implications associated. I think there's also the additional, and probably, again, might not go straight to the heart of your question because it is just another funding bucket, but the Australian government has also announced more mechanisms to support infrastructure delivery. We'll find out more as that program gets defined, and I can't remember the name off the top of my head at the moment. But I think we'll find out more about that towards the end of the year, and hopefully that'll give us a sense about how we can start working with some of those councils to support infrastructure delivery in their broader growth.
And I recognise, we've got a lot of new stuff happening, but I think what we need policy to be developed so that over time there can be far more integrated ways of bringing that together instead of having all of the different silos, as well as that policy support for project aggregation and finance aggregation, so that projects can be delivered in rural regions.
Kayla, you mentioned this as well, didn't you, as a
Yeah,
theme?
it goes to, again, it's a systemic thing, and the Regional Australia Institute has the Rebalancing the Nation and a call for a national population plan. Planning Institute of Australia is also calling for a national settlement strategy. And at the moment, what we've got on exhibition is a national housing and homelessness plan that doesn't talk across any of that. So we do need to look again at what are we anticipating for economic development in the regions? What populations will we need for that? Again, it's doing that chicken and egg, but making sure you pin it down, because what tends to happen, and you're right, is you'll have something happening here, but the infrastructure isn't ready. So what the New South Wales government, I think it's just passed, and to their credit, I think it's probably a good idea, is a regional infrastructure contributions scheme. So across the regions for sort of major developments, they're paying into an infrastructure bucket, and that's to support open space, education facilities, that sort of thing. What we would like to see acknowledged in that is they're listing a lot of social and physical infrastructure as funding areas, and affordable housing is listed there, but we've been told that that won't be something that is specifically funded or targeted for. They're more focused on the other areas. So I think, yes, physical infrastructure, but also recognising affordable housing as that key social cohesion infrastructure too. And yeah, underpinning all of that is what is our growth plan, what areas are growing and why, what diversified industries are going to be there in 50, 100 years time, like big time frames to plan for all of that too.
They're long outside our electoral cycles.
Yes,
I think that's one of the challenges here, to be honest, isn't it? Steve, you've also talked about that need for a bit of a more cohesive and coordinated kind of approach.
Oh, look, definitely, I totally agree with you with your position, and it is a policy issue and it's a funding issue, and the two things aren't necessarily aligning. There are lots of motherhood statements and policies about regional growth and development, but the funding isn't there. I think developer contributions work in metro areas where you've got strong growth. Doesn't really work in regional locations because the development can't afford it, and often it's the local council that will go put itself into debt or delay. Like projects can be delayed just because the funding isn't there. So yeah, we need something that's more realistic and understands the infrastructure needs and the timing, and is available at the right time. So I totally agree. It's sort of a failure of the system.
Yeah, thank you. I had a question over here somewhere. Thank you.
Is this on?
Yes.
I just further to that question, I live in Nambucca Heads, about 45 kilometres from Coffs Harbour, and as people would know, in regional areas, there's huge local unemployment for Aboriginal people and young people, and as we've mentioned, while ERA accommodation's great, it can also displace those disadvantaged communities. I'm just wondering if any of you have had any experience with transport and local employment initiatives in the partnerships and work that you've been doing, because I find it surprising that we can get thousands of kids to school every day, but there's no regional transport solutions for getting workers. And so often there's workers right there in communities or close by communities, but because regional transport is just non-existent for workers, I'm just wondering if you guys have had any conversations with councils or around trying to fix those things.
Good question. Anybody like to?
Not really.
So this is a big thing for the Institute. we're always looking at what we call sort of local learning systems or local employment systems, because it really is a system. You know, you've got the kids, you've got the young people, you've got the parents telling them what they can and can't do, you've got the schools telling them what they can and can't do. So that really is, and what we're just about to release some work we've done which looks at how some places around, some communities across Australia have really worked to bring that system together. Transport's a part of it, right? Because it means the community then is accepting that there's some responsibility for closing some of the gaps in these systems. And I would also say, have a look in Tassie. Tassie's doing some really interesting stuff at the moment, both in terms of really localising sort of entities which they call regional jobs hubs to kind of bring that system together. They're not just unemployment services, there's more to it. And as part of that process, they've got these local buses that they're running within those regions under the auspices of those hubs, again, to try to take people without transport to work, recognising that it is part of that system that needs to be closed. So this is very hit and miss. You know, you have some jurisdictions, some places doing it for some time and then it comes and goes. It's one of the problems with it, but we often have a few examples around the place, people being a bit more enthusiastic. Now we've got another question down the front here and perhaps one over here to finish off. So go to you if you like.
Can I just interrupt?
Yeah, sure.
I want to say, like, I'm from Unity Housing,
Yep.
so thank you. But for those who asked about insurance,
Yep.
insurance...
Can we get a microphone? Can we just get a microphone? Because the people online can't hear you.
For those that are being streamed, they can't
Just hang on, the
hear your
people online
question.
can't hear you, so we'll just get your microphone.
So I just want to say about insurance. So some of the large community housing providers in Australia have just formed an insurance mutual because insurance was absolutely out of control for them. So they are taking control. They will run the mutual. And equally, some of the regional councils in South Australia formed an insurance mutual probably 6 or 7 years ago for exactly the reasons you were talking about. Because they have the data, they have the knowledge, they know how to do it, and have now got insurance at a more affordable rate. So I wanted to point that there are alternate ways to think about this. So Unity is part of that insurance mutual. Again, we try to innovate.
You do. Thank you very much for that.
No,
South Australia,
it is the Australian community housing providers. So I certainly South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales, and I think Brisbane Housing Company's in it as well.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, that's a really, really good. We might have one last question over here, I think, and then we'll have to wrap it up. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris Munro from Mornington Peninsula Shire. My question's probably one of more, I guess, that peri-regional urban fringe kind of element where we've got councils across the country that I guess fall between that gap, that they're not regional but they're also not really metro, but have all those same kind of key worker challenges, lack of accommodation, often in holiday areas like we are. So I think of things like us and Yarra Ranges, some of those areas. My question is, are you seeing kind of the pressures, because we're not dealing properly with those urban fringe environments, onto regional areas? Because I know that's certainly something that's happening where we are. And I guess what's a way forward for some of those, I guess, peri-regional or urban fringe kind of areas to deal with some of their challenges? Because ultimately it's placing the challenges onto those regional areas.
Yes, it is. Thank you. Sarah, is that part of your radar? How are you saying? Because there's a really strong gradation across southeast Queensland, isn't there, in particular?
Yeah, and I guess we're guided by need. So when we talk about where our housing delivery is focused at the moment, it is definitely informed by need, and we've also got work underway in partnership with Ahuri actually to inform our broader demand delivery approach to how we deliver social housing. I probably don't have, I think because of the vastness of the state, each of those communities we deal with have slightly different processes or complexities. So I don't think I've seen specifically the example you're talking about, but I'm sort of wondering from a planning perspective, is that something you've seen, Kayla?
Sorry, I missed at the start. You from Mornington Peninsula? Yeah. Again, I think and we talked about transport before. I think it's that I often think about Penrith is almost regional in some respects in some of the challenges that they're facing out there as well, and southwestern Sydney. So you're right in that it does have this, what we're seeing is an expanding out into the Blue Mountains and that sort of thing, people trying to move further along the train line to get to somewhere a bit cheaper. As for the planning aspects, as we know, generally greenfield sprawling is cheaper, it's understood, it's invested in well, and it's the 3-bedroom, single-story detached family home that people are trying to age in, people are trying to form share houses in because that's the only housing topology they get. And that sort of sprawl, again, you get less users per kilometre for your transport. So then you have car reliance. And so it becomes this big cycle. I'm probably not telling you anything new, and I don't exactly have the solutions here, but I guess this is where it comes back to having more medium density development in regional centres that can support that growth. And it's not just peri-urban fringe. And the peri-urban fringe situation, it's not sustainable socially or environmentally to keep degrading our agricultural land in that way. And it's been cheap for so long because we haven't valued that land in the way that we probably should. That's probably all I have to say on that.
That's very good, very helpful. Steve?
Well, look, Mornington, you've probably got, you know, the full range of issues we've been talking about, and you've got the expensive homes, and you've got the, as you say, people moving down the train line, finding somewhere to live.
The Airbnbs.
You've got the Airbnbs. But, you know, and I'm sure, you know, we're not telling you anything you don't already know, but you need that diversity of housing. And obviously, you know, the community is having to deal with change as it progresses through the municipality. But you do have access to, you know, you've got all of your metro councils to work with. You've got access to some level of funding. And I know Mornington has had a good look at, you know, what spare land it has available and those sort of things. So, you know, I think Mornington has been quite active in addressing the issues. But yeah, you've got the full range of challenges, I think, to deal with. Yeah.
Yeah. I think. Look, I think it comes back to this policy question. We don't, you know, we're state and to a lesser extent federally, but certainly the state and the capital city growth plans really do still favour the outer suburbs. This is the model that we're kind of locked into. It is unsustainable in so many ways. We need to shift our gaze. You know, we need to start thinking differently about how we do this stuff because it's in nobody's interest to see those outer edges sprawl. And I can give you an example of that. Our regional movers index from the last quarter, we looked specifically at where people who were going to Geelong were coming from. They were bailing out of those outer suburbs of Melbourne at a great rate. So they're not happy, right? So we keep providing more of this sort of junk and people are telling us they don't want it. They want to move out to the next area out and the next area out. So for heaven's sake, in a sort of holistic sense, let's look at the state. Let's look at Greater Melbourne and beyond. Let's look at Greater Sydney and beyond. Let's look at Greater Brisbane and beyond. Recognise that people are not happy with what they're being offered. The market is not providing what people need, no matter what the developers tell us. Let's do something differently. Let's recognise what people are valuing and do something differently. So, I don't know. Sorry to rant and rave, but on that note, we're now heading into. No, we're not heading to lunch at all. I'm going to ignore that entirely. There are more sessions coming up after morning tea. Please join me in thanking our panel, and I hope you've enjoyed the discussion.
Sorry, I thought you were test. I'm not a